Hey, we're back looking at Unwrapping the Pharaohs, lesson number 17. And we're going to be talking about Thutmose III. He's known as the greatest of all the pharaohs, and so we're going to try to hopefully figure out why. But first, his parents was Thutmose II and Queen Iset. And Iset was the second wife of Thutmose II. And that was his father. And unfortunately, his father died somewhere when he was between like 3 and 12 years old. And so he, at that early age, is crowned king immediately upon his father's death, but was decided that he was too young to reign. And if you remember, Hatshepsut was his co-regent during this time, and he ruled with her for a little while. And it says, eventually, Hatshepsut assumed the role of regent for Thutmose III. She eventually crowned herself pharaoh and reigned 22 years in peace. And technically, he was co-regent for those 22 years. But after 22 years of sharing the throne, he finally becomes the sole ruler of Egypt, okay? And he claims that ultimately he was always the rightful king and considered himself the rightful king always, even during the 22 years that he shared with Hatshepsut. He dates his reign from that very beginning time period as a child, to include the 22 years that he shared with Hatshepsut. But then his first year as a solo ruler, he starts to assert his authority immediately. He swings into military action and he leads his army from the front. He marches north with them and he sets out on some military campaigns. We know this information from the temple that he built at Karnak. On the wall of his chapel, he left this huge military record that's there, and he talks about the conquest that he had of 119 different cities. Okay, on page 126 of your book, it says, "Year 22, fourth month of the second season, day 25. His Majesty passed the fortress of Sile on the first campaign of victory, which His Majesty made to extend the frontiers of Egypt. Year 23, which would be his second year of reign, solo reign, first month of the third season, day 16, as far as the town of Yehem. His Majesty ordered a conference with his victorious army, speaking as follows: That wretched enemy of Kadesh has come and has entered into Megiddo. He is there at this moment. He has gathered to him the princes of every foreign country which had been loyal to Egypt, as well as those as far as Naharin and Matini, them of Heru, them of Kod, their horses and their armies and their people. For he says, so it is reported. I shall wait here in Megiddo to fight against his majesty. Will you tell me what is in your hearts?" Okay, so he just immediately sets out on these military campaigns, and Megiddo winds up being a huge campaign for him. Okay, the troops are very apprehensive to march through this narrow pass that leads to Megiddo, and basically, Thutmose challenges him. Right, he challenges his troops to do it. He says, "I'm leading from the front. You have to follow me." I don't know if you still say this anymore, but when I was a teenager, they'd say, "I dare you. I dare you to do it." And basically, this is what Moses III does to his troops. He says, "I dare you. Come on, let's go." And because of this pride that the troops have, and then they just kind of feel like, oh, now I don't have a choice, so we have to go. There's no recording that we find of going through the passage. It apparently is uneventful. But we know they made it through, because at Megiddo, they have a very major victory. On page 127 of your book, it says, "Then they saw His Majesty prevailing over them, and they fled headlong to Megiddo with faces of fear. They abandoned their horses and their chariots of gold and silver, so that someone might draw them up into this town by hoisting them by their garments." Basically, Megiddo was a rout. And Thutmose III claims his fame, especially from Megiddo and just his military campaigns, and just became a true warrior and expanded the Egyptian kind of frontier. So when we start looking at this historically, as sometimes happens with the Egyptian history, is we're not sure if the timeline fits exactly, right? And then there's a Professor Velikovsky who believes the Egyptian timeline on this event specifically is wrong. He believes that the chronology of Egypt should be drastically reduced, and therefore it would make Thutmose III basically on par or contemporary with Solomon's son Rehoboam. And then if you use this based on the Megiddo victory inscription is where he kind of draws some of his information. He looks at the inscription on the walls of Karnak about the Battle of Megiddo, and he's, on page 128 says the capturing of Megiddo is capturing of 1,000 towns. Now the princes of this foreign country came on their bellies to kiss the ground to the glory of his majesty and to beg breath for their nostrils because his army is so great, because the prowess of Ammon was so great over his foreign country. Okay? And it goes on and talks about this is the area of Kadesh, and it was talking about the kingdom of Kadesh and the king of Kadesh. But there are some problems with identifying the king of Kadesh. Okay? There's some thoughts that this king of Kadesh is from Jerusalem, but get a little ahead of myself. But first, what they recorded on the temple kind of goes along with 1 Kings, okay? This in 1 Kings chapter 14, 25 and 26, it says, "It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house, and he took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made." Basically, they came and plundered Jerusalem. There's no record of Shishak fighting against Jerusalem or capturing Jerusalem, just simply came in and plundered. And they believe that this is because the battle actually happened at Megiddo. Thutmose III, in his pictorial record from the wall of Karnak, says he captured 300 gold shields. 1 Kings 10:17 said there was 300 gold shields that Solomon had, right? The Thutmose's record also shows that there's captured doors overlaid with gold. You find that in 1 Kings 6:32. The list that he puts on his wall at Karnak is consistent with the treasures listed in the biblical record in 1 Kings. And so that's why Velikovsky believes that date should be changed. Again, we go back to Kadesh, right? And they're talking about the king of Kadesh. It's the Hebrew word for holy. Jerusalem is frequently referred to as the holy city. So he's claiming that the king of Kadesh is Rehoboam, the king of Jerusalem at this point, okay? So then we deal with the Pharaoh Shishak. It's the 22nd dynasty, usually identified as the Shishak of the Bible, okay? And the list of conquering cities on the south wall of Karnak. No mention of Jerusalem. It mentions Mitanni, but that ceased to exist as a nation 400 years before the relief was made. The actual dates that Velikovsky believes for the Shishak reign cannot be determined from Egyptian records, thus proving that it was Thutmose III and Rehoboam, according to Velikovsky, okay? So let's get back to Thutmose, okay? If this time where he basically conquers and he has all this gold and all this money, he's captured everything, he's taken all the plunder from Jerusalem, it allows him to start building things, right? But he's not a prolific builder. One of his main things that he built was the Temple of Karnak. It's his most notable achievement. There's this huge festal hall that's in there, and that has these reliefs and inscriptions and things written all over them. He also built some obelisks, or had them made. The relief wall at Karnak depicts 2, but he actually built 7. 4 of these obelisks we know have gone to other countries. One that's named Cleopatra's Needle is at the bank of the Thames River in London, and it was shipped there in 1877. His largest obelisk was about 105 feet tall and weighed 455 tons. It's currently in the city of Rome in front of the St. John's Lateran Church, okay? There's one in New York, and there's one in Istanbul. that was there, placed there for the Emperor Julian in around AD 390. So just, as we continue to go through here and we look at things, we realize that he was, during his battle of Megiddo, he dealt with things there. He had his different military campaigns that he went through, where he had conducted 17 military campaigns against Palestine and Syria. He conquered, looted, and established authority over a very wide area. The tribute just flowed into Egypt during this time, which allowed him to build these things. And because of all of this, his military victories, the money that was flowing into Egypt, his building and different things, that's why he gets this name, that making him the greatest of all the pharaohs, okay? The last thing a couple of last things we want to talk about is, he ruled peacefully with Hatshepsut for 22 years. And for several years after he became sole ruler, there was no problems with Hatshepsut. He co-ruled for 22 years, left her dignity intact for the first 17 years of his sole reign. And then for some reason that scholars still haven't figured out, he becomes very hostile towards her. He reverses many of the things he said. He starts destroying her statues and her monuments and smashes them to pieces. He starts scratching off and deleting her names from monuments and records. And it's very confusing because there's no clear reason why. Some people claim that it's to justify he was the sole ruler for that long period of time without her. Others say that he was getting some influence about a female should have never been pharaoh, so kind of get rid of her. But ultimately we don't know, and it just leaves us a little confusion. But he still bears this title, greatest of all pharaohs. Eventually, like everyone, he dies, and we find his tomb. It's called KV 34 in the Valley of the Kings. He died in the 54th year of the reign, which makes him about 65 years old. His mummy was surprising because he's this great military leader, this great victor. He's considered the greatest of all pharaohs. But when they open it up and find his mummy, he was only 5'8" tall. He was kind of a short man, and so his mummy has been given the nickname, maybe not the greatest for him, but it's called the Egyptian Napoleon. Napoleon was a short military leader. And so, that doesn't take away from, being short doesn't take away from his, military prowess, but it was an interesting fact that they wanted to note because he was built as this, even his statues kind of show him as this towering, big person. In reality, he was not. So just remember, Thutmose III, the greatest pharaoh of all times. Thanks.